What's up guys, we're going to be doing a Jordan Peterson reaction video and taking a look at some of his best comebacks. So I've been following Jordan Peterson for a number of years now. I've read Maps of Meaning, I've gone through the entire biblical series, I've watched so many of his lectures and videos, and a ton of his interviews. So I think I can provide a little bit of context and background information for what we're gonna see in this compilation here. So sit down, this is gonna be awesome, and let's dive right into it.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest? The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
Okay. So, like, I don't know what answer you could give to like a rhetorically loaded question like that. Notice how they aren't asking if there are Nazis at the rally. It's asking how do you feel about the presence of Nazis at the rally? So what can he say? Go back to the basics. He doesn't like Nazis. Easily enough said. Let's keep going.
And I'm sure, I would hope that if I were a student of Dr. Peterson, that he would refer to me as she and wouldn't have a problem with that. But at the end of the day, you know, a personal pronoun preference still is a preference for what language other people use. And at the end of the day, I don't have ultimate control over what Dr. Peterson, what the language he chooses to use, or anybody else for that matters. That's up to them.
Okay, let me find out then.
The problem arises.
Let me find out. If she were a student of yours, what would you call her?
She.
You would.
He's like, yeah, she. I feel like the girl is going to ask a better question. I don't know why the interviewer interrupted there. This is hardly a comeback, you know what I mean? Like, okay, let's keep going.
Okay. We've established that.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean,
right, there you go. There you go. One of the classic JP quotes, powerful. It's just like, just imagine you have heard that question, like go to a desert island, you're there with like a small group of people, you can have freedom of speech or the right to not be offended. What does your intuition say? Let's keep going because I think it gets even better here.
look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
Okay. That's amazing. And the best part about that, you notice there, is he says, you're doing what you should be doing, which is digging a bit to figure out what's going on. He's giving the other person the benefit of the doubt. He's speaking to their purpose. You might think, bad interviewer, good Jordan Peterson, but it's not even as nuanced as that. Like, there is room for critique. Jordan Peterson says that himself in the biblical series. He says that about cultural critique. But also for him, it's like there's room to critique him. Good faith critique, good faith discussion. And when you give someone the benefit of the doubt there, it just makes your opinion, not your opinions, but your ideas, their arguments land even harder because it's meeting them where they're at. And it's actually criticizing them and not your mental construction of them. So let's keep going.
Go on.
So
and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
Ha, gotcha.
you have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head.
And there's not a secular humanist organization or country on the planet that has ever produced as a good thing, an intentional good thing, rapists and murderers. So,
Well, that's highly debatable. That's highly debatable.
actually,
I mean, one of the
it's
things
absolutely true because there's never been a secular humanist government on the planet.
I don't know. I think the Soviets were pretty secular.
No,
humanists.
Then,
I know
with all due apologies, you do not know the first thing about what secular humanism is.
Why would you have a debate with someone with someone who you say has no clue about what you're debating? That doesn't make any sense. And did you see how his voice rose when he had to interrupt him? He's like, no, no, no. He said something like that. It's like, you can tell he's in his thinking brain there. He's like, there's a response that's going on in his mind is scrambling to try to take back control of something he just said that's offensive, because it seems like this guy, I've actually seen the full version of this, I forget his name, starts with a D, Dila Hudi or something, and that suggests he's kind of bought into this ideology of secular humanism, and then any attack on it is like an attack on him. You see how there's that like primal response kicking in when Jordan Peterson just made the subtle remark that the self-proclaimed atheistic, secular, humanistic country of history resulted in the intentional production of rapists and murderers in the Gulag system. That's the Soviets. Read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago if you haven't yet, by the way. So we got a little bit triggered there, we could say. Let's keep going.
You should read the secular humanist manifestos, because what happened in Russia and communist countries was an institution of a religious-like structure centered around an individual and forced atheism, none of which is consistent with humanism.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. It's like, you should read the humanistic, manifesto we said, or the documents or something. The problem is when that's put into practice, say in the Soviet Union, it doesn't really turn out like it is in the documents. And that's the problem. If it's not doable by human beings, then it's not doable. Let's keep going.
American philosopher Beyonce Knowles said that it has been said that racism is so American that if you challenge racism, you look like you're challenging America. We are challenging inequality. We are challenging the refusal to see me as an individual. When we overcome that, have at it, we're all on equal plane.
I think it's good. The pot is getting stirred here.
So I've got a couple of questions.
So let's your side spoke, so I'm going to go to Jordan, then to you.
Remember, this is cut and this is edited. We don't know exactly the full conversation. I've seen this and I know what's going on. What you just said there sound pretty reasonable, honestly. No problem with that. But if you watch the whole thing, you kind of see what's going on and the reason why there's extra emphasis behind Jordan Peterson here.
Let's assume for a moment that I've benefited from my white privilege. Okay, so let's assume that. That's fine. That's what you would say. So, so let's say, here, let's get precise about this, okay?
Was that very individual of you?
Let's get precise about this.
Let's get precise.
To what degree is my present level of attainment or achievement a consequence of my white privilege? And I don't mean sort of. I mean, do you mean 5%? Do you mean 15%? Do you mean 25%? Do you mean 75%? And what do you propose I do about it? How about a tax? How about a tax that's like specialized for me so that I can account for my damn privilege, so that I can stop hearing about it? Now, let's get precise about one other thing, okay? We'll get precise about one other thing.
Precise?
Yeah, precise, yes. And so, if we can agree, and we haven't, that the left can go too far, which it clearly can, then how would my worthy opponents precisely define when the left that they stand for has gone too far? You didn't like equity, equality of outcome. I think that's a great marker. But if you have a better suggestion and won't sidestep the question, so let's figure out how I can dispense with my white privilege, and so that you can tell me when the left has gone too far, since they clearly can. And that's what this debate is about political correctness. It's about the left going too far. And I think it's gone too far in many ways. And I'd like to figure out exactly how and when, so the reasonable left could make its ascendance again and we could quit all this nonsense.
When you talk about...
I love that. So we can quit all this nonsense and have the reasonable left ascend again. Beautiful words. I think that was kind of the saving grace for the very obvious frustration that was coming up to the surface. But let's give him the benefit of the doubt. There was a lot of mocking going on there. Not productive at all. Precise. Interrupting him. Not very effective. I mean, the crowd was liking it. He happened to be very charismatic. Maybe Jordan Peterson isn't as charismatic in that scenario. Let's keep going.
Feminizing men, it almost sounds derogatory. It's almost as if you're saying that to be feminine or to express any sort of femininity is actually inferior to masculinity. And I think that is a huge problem even within the language that we use. When you say, don't be such a girl, don't be such a pussy, the greatest insults that men can give each other tend to have feminine origins, as I said, pussy or faggot or anything like that. And I think, again, that speaks to a very systematic inequality between the genders. And
you attributed the rates of mental illness among men to their inability to express, say, sentimental emotions. And I don't think there's a shred of clinical evidence to support that stance.
Sorry.
No. I don't think there's a shred of evidence to support that stance. The kind of violence, for example, that Lawrence is discussing is a consequence of competitive violence among young men.
I think there is some evidence that men find it difficult to talk about things, and that
and they also
ways
find
in which you can help young
out.
men to talk about things.
And that's the evidence for the differential rates of mental health suffering.
I also don't think when you're talking about things being so innate. Judith Butler would have said that, gender is a construct, that gender is a performance.
Well, Judith Butler doesn't know what she's talking about in the least, so I don't accept that.
That's interesting, but
she's no scientist, she doesn't know the psychological literature.
And this is all under the...
She's no psychologist, she doesn't know the psychological literature. So you saw what happened there is they had to go down this little rabbit hole until they got to the place where they actually disagreed, which is about the extent to which the human experience is socially constructed versus biologically constructed. You could say, if you want to make that division, which even has its own nuance to it. And she's like, well, I don't know how to handle that statement. And he just claps back with, she's not a psychologist and not a scientist. Now, that might be true, or she doesn't know the scientific literature. That might be true, but you'd have to look even more closely at it to properly criticize it, to properly get a sense of what's going on. You could tell, though, that he was exhausted. He's like monotone. No. Let's keep going.
The influence, you say, of postmodernism and neo-Marxism.
Yeah,
but aren't those things two separate things?
They're completely separate. And this is something I've been criticized for. Dr. Peterson doesn't understand the difference between neo-Marxism and postmodernism. It's like, I understand the difference perfectly well. It isn't me that's conflating them. It turns out that the people who push postmodern doctrines in the university almost always ally themselves with a Marxist viewpoint. And that is logically incoherent. But I would say the postmodernists really don't give a damn for logical coherence, because they regard that as part of the oppressive, patriarchal, Eurocentric view of the world. The idea that there's an objective reality and all of that, and that you can deal with it with logic.
You accept this oppression.
Cool. See, okay, yeah, that's fire. He has been criticized for that, and because Marxism is a grand narrative, and if you know about postmodernism, it's the idea that it's a skepticism of grand narratives, you could say. How could you have people who are criticizing grand narratives back a particular grand narrative? And I think the answer is that actually there are postmodernists and activists in the universities who do disagree. Because the activists would say, we actually need these concepts of gender in order to deal with inequalities in society. Around gender, you could say, or around race. We need these concepts of race, even though a postmodernist could point to interracial people or mixed people, halfies, as being something that challenges these strict categories of race. That would be a postmodernism way of doing it. But the activists, the Marxists might say, well, you see the oppressors and the victims, and they have to be clear categories or else our framework doesn't work, so we're not going to work with the postmodernists. But the problem is they both ally when they're criticizing Western society, because when you see it from a Marxist perspective, or when you apply the postmodernist principles to it, they both work. They both have that as part of the project. So it's a weird allyship that shouldn't make sense, but that he's noted in his term, the postmodern neo-Marxist. You could call it the grievance studies departments. There were two professors who, you can look that up, grievance studies, that covers it too. You could say the activist types or the social justice types. Who is it? Jonathan Haidt, H-E-I-D-T. He's discussed the idea of universities shifting priorities, of being one from truth to now being one about justice. I think that's a very useful framework, is that some departments have swapped to be less about truth and more about justice. And what we're seeing is a consequence of that with the postmodern neo-Marxist types in the universities. Let's keep going.
Narrative without question. 120 years ago...
I don't accept anything without question. I'm just telling you a fact.
That's not a fact.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
Women were expected to stay home and take care of the kids and cook a meal.
Women didn't have reliable birth control until 1960. Don't you think that played a role? Don't you think the fact that they didn't have reliable care for
Are you
their
blaming women for not being allowed to lead countries, to lead nations? Because they didn't
were allowed to lead nations. There were queens in many countries. I think you have no idea how much this oppression narrative has saturated your thinking.
Why do you think it is that so much...
Remember, Catherine the Great, she was a boss. Look up the queens of history and the empresses of history. They're crazy. In a good way. It's awesome. So those kind of things challenge that narrative. I think that was interesting. Like a lot of the modern thinking, like we kind of can't look further back than like World War I. Before then, like, do we know about the Boer War in South Africa? Do we know about like late 18th century stuff? I guess maybe like Napoleonic thing, maybe we kind of get the like secondary and third order consequences of Nietzsche's thinking in that time, but the worldview at the time is kind of diluted. It's so far in the past, we can only really think in terms of that. Like, that's a very relevant comment for maybe like the nuclear families of the 40s and 50s, right? Like that's when you had that, at least in my perception, that there's that strong framework. But then after that, the 60s happened and that changed everything. So there's that discussion going on there. Very 20th century focus. Let's keep going.
Much of what you say is so very popular with the alt-right.
It isn't. And you don't have any evidence for that at all. More than the evidence that alt-right people watch this show.
Neo-Nite website, Saviour of Western Civilization.
Oh, well, that was all taken apart today by a number of Jewish publications, by the way, showing that, first of all, that was all satirical commentary on the part of the alt-right, directed at taking me down, for example. And there was an alt-right article yesterday published saying that I was a Jewish stooge and shill. So this is absolute nonsense, and I don't appeal primarily to the alt-right. There's no evidence for that at all. It's the proclivity of...
I never said primarily, Jordan. What I'm interested in is why you think that you get the reaction that you do from the alt-right. Looking at the Cathy Newman documentary.
What reaction?
Interview.
There's 10 million people watched that and commented on it.
I'm talking about what I saw, and I'm curious to know what your reaction was to the glee with which the alt-right seized upon that issue.
I don't accept. Should we deal with the death threats? I mean, she had, I think, a dozen.
I don't accept the concept that it was the alt-right that was doing this. There were 10 million people who commented on that video, and about 95% of them commented negatively on Cathy Newman's behavior. You think there's 10 million alt-right trolls watching that?
I see very little of the pursuit.
The thing is, you're always going to have fringe groups checking out every single thing that gets really popular. And if you only really focus on like the 10 comments of people with Pepe, whatever, icons in their account or whatever, then you're just going to focus on that. And you can see like that interview, if you just watch it, like any reasonable person would hear what Cathy Newman's saying in her style of speaking and be like, what is going on here? So anyway, let's keep going.
Pursuit of justice characterizing the modern university. I see a tremendous amount of the pursuit of vengeance for things that don't even deserve to have vengeance extracted for them.
So give me an example of what doesn't deserve vengeance.
How about the existence of the patriarchy?
But you don't mean now that women have not suffered injustices. In Britain, Virginia Woolf couldn't go to university, or rather she couldn't get a degree. Women have been excluded in all kinds of ways from social situations, have they not?
Yes, but people have been excluded from social situations in all kinds of ways. And I don't like the narrative, the social historical injustice narrative as a way of looking at the world. The way that young people now are taught about the relationships between men and women throughout history is that the fundamental narrative is that men oppressed women throughout the course of history. And then that kind of came to an end when everybody woke up in 1964.
No.
Yeah, really. That's really it.
No, listen, I don't know what it's like in Canadian universities, but that's what I call, and forgive this European reference, that's a kind of Punch and Judy way of seeing it. That is not how universities as a whole operate.
Well, that's how they operate in Canada. We had the biggest scandal in Canadian university history last year when a graduate student was hauled in front of a Maoist inquisition for daring to show a 5-minute video of me discussing issues like this on public television. The universities are in far worse shape. Maybe they're not in such bad shape in the UK as they are in North America, but they're in plenty bad shape in North America.
Lindsay Shepherd, look up Lindsay Shepherd. I think, was it Dalhousie University? It was some East Coast Canadian university. Shout out West Coast. I went to UBC. Great time, great university, in my experience. Now, so she actually showed his video in a class and had open discussion around it. She didn't frame it, and then got pulled into a discussion between like a professor, a TA, and some department person around how that was bad and wrong. And she recorded it, and it showed just like how they didn't want even ideas to be shown from Jordan Peterson's perspective. And there's a lot of controversy around that. So look that up. Lindsay Shepherd, really, really, really powerful stuff. Let's keep going.
Give me, and I'm sorry you were involved, but that is not the biggest scandal. The biggest scandal will be the number, for instance, of suicides that are prevalent amongst undergraduates. The fact that one academic was holed up, in my view, inappropriately for doing what was done is not the biggest scandal. You're inflating
It's
things.
not the biggest tragedy. The suicides are a bigger tragedy, but it was certainly the biggest scandal. Canadian universities don't make international news.
Your background, it's pretty earthy, but how did you connect that with your current political perspective? You said that you became disillusioned with socialism.
I became disillusioned with ideology,
With ideology in general.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's certainly not something that's changed. I mean, I don't like ideologues.
Okay, awesome. He doesn't like ideologues. That's it. Simple as that. This is Jordan Peterson Reactions. Please click like and subscribe. See you guys next time.